Stella's husband is dead, and at the funeral, he unexpectedly wakes up. Everyone there is excited, curious to know how he's alive except for Stella, who is horrified when her husband turns to look at her. He knows what she has done. Sitting in the front row, Stella vigorously dabbed at the corner of her eyes with the handkerchief in her hands. Compared to before, she was much calmer than when she wailed loudly in the hall for them to allow her to follow her husband to the afterlife. I don't want to live anymore. The love of my life is dead. Stella screamed with tears rolling down her face. I can't live without him. Her voice echoed loudly in the packed funeral hall as people stood around her doing their best to comfort her. She wore a plain black gown that looked too ordinary to be worn by the wife of a billionaire, and everyone there couldn't help but sympathize with the pain she felt. Stella's eyes were beyond swollen, and her voice was so hoarse that it was clear that she had been crying for hours. Friends and family of George, her husband, instantly flocked to comfort her, completely discarding the fact that they had been against their marriage from the very beginning. Stella had been 19 when she met George, a billionaire and the sole owner of multi-million-dollar companies. They had all instantly assumed that she was nothing but a gold digger and how impossible it was for such a young woman to be genuinely in love with a 64-year-old man. But after 6 years of watching them stay together and seeing Stella's love and affection towards George, his family soon believed that Stella was in love with George. This was why they couldn't help but be a little sad to see her throw herself to the ground out of grief. They all stood beside her to help and support her as much as they could. Stella, George is 70. He's an old man, and it was simply his time to die. Jane, one of George's younger sisters, comforted her with a pitiful look on her face as she handed Stella another handkerchief. Not once since they got to the funeral hall had she been able to stop crying as the people around her struggled to hold her up. Everything will be fine, Stella. We're all grieving his death. Sarah, another of his sisters, comforted her, but Stella shook her head and continued to cry. I'm too young to be a widow. He promised we'll still spend more years together, she cried. Her face and cheeks were deep red from the tears, and everyone felt saddened by the fact that there was nothing they said or did that could stop her from crying. Around her, in the background, soft murmurs filled the air as the funeral guests whispered to each other. They were such a loving couple. Their love was the kind that proved that age doesn't matter. If only he didn't die from a sudden heart attack. What I would give for them to have more years together. But despite the murmurs around her, Stella continued to mourn silently in her seat. Although her tears finally stopped flowing, she had a lifeless expression on her face, like her soul had been completely drained. One after the other, people stood up to pay their last respects, with everyone walking to console her before returning to their seats. George's entire family was there, and most of her family members were there, too, surrounding her to offer words of comfort. Finally, it was time for her to pay her last respects. The second she got up, her feet wobbled so badly that someone close to her needed to reach out to support her before she fell to the ground. Thank you, Stella softly whispered under her breath without looking back to check who supported her. I want to walk on my own, she courageously said, and Jane, who held her, instantly agreed and pulled back. She was George's sister, but she understood that the bond between husband and wife was just as strong as the one she had with her brother. She needs to say goodbye on her own, Jane resolved in her mind as she waited, ready to run to help her when Stella needed it. Stella walked forward, trembling all over as she moved towards the casket. In her hands was a badly ruined flower, which she clenched so tightly that all the petals were utterly squashed, but no one seemed to care. George, Stella suddenly cried, her head bowed as she stared at the dead body of her husband. The last time she saw him was when she saw him fall to the ground and die, but seeing him again, she couldn't help but stretch her hand to touch his face. A last attempt to touch him and kiss him goodbye as he embarked on his journey in the afterlife. Stella leaned in towards the casket, and no one thought anything of it until they heard her utter a sharp scream as she jerked back with a horrified expression on her face. Jane and Sarah, George's sister, instantly ran forward to help her. What's wrong? Jane hurriedly asked, wrapping her arms around Stella, feeling her entire body tremble so severely that it looked like she was having a seizure. What happened? Are you okay? Sarah also asked in a very concerned tone, showing how much she cared about Stella's well-being. Instead of responding, Stella's entire focus was on the casket in front of her as she continued to shake. Hey, he blinked, Stella whispered in a low whisper, one that both Jane and Sarah could still hear. That's impossible. He's dead, Jane replied, looking back at the body in the casket. You want him to be alive so badly that you're seeing things, Sarah agreed as she looked back at the casket, only for the both of them to be shocked to see George blink. By then, most of the people in the hall had already gotten up from their seats to approach the casket the second they heard Stella scream. Everyone was curious to know why she would suddenly scream in such a way. Hey, he blinked, Stella continued to stammer with a pale expression, only to fall to the ground in shock when she watched George open his eyes and raise his body. It's a miracle, someone shouted, voicing the feelings of everyone there the moment they all saw George open his eyes. They were all alarmed, but their joy was much greater than their fear, considering how good and kind George was to his family, workers, and everyone around him. "George, you're alive," Jane shouted, moving closer to hug him, glad to see her brother alive. Sarah also did the same as she moved forward to take a closer look at the person they all thought was dead. "Are you really alive?" Sarah hurriedly asked at the same time with a blissful look on their face. "Yes, I'm alive," George responded, and Stella instantly ran towards him with tears in her eyes. "George, I'm so glad you're alive." Stella screamed loud enough for everyone there to feel just how happy she was that the husband she thought was dead was actually alive. "It's a miracle. I thought I'd never," she said, moving closer to touch him, only for George to slap her hand away before her finger could graze the skin of his face. Smack. The sound was loud enough to ring sharply in the air as everyone watched Stella hold her hand in pain, as slowly tears began to stream down her face. "George, why? Why would you?" she cried, gasping and clenching her hands together over her chest like she was in mind-blowing pain. She looked so pitiful that even Jane couldn't help but move closer to her with a confused expression as she looked over at George, who completely ignored her. His gaze was entirely on Stella instead. "George, what could I possibly have?" she began to wail, but this time, George didn't even allow her to finish, opening his mouth to speak. "You can stop acting now, I know what you did," George told her, looking at her with a cold and distant gaze, one that conveyed a deep hostility that shocked everyone there. Hearing his words, everyone in the hall had an entirely confused expression, but one thing a few noticed was the horror that flashed across Stella's face at George's unexpected words. All his family members instantly rushed to ask him what happened and why he would suddenly treat his wife in such a way. "George, did you forget Stella? This is Stella, your wife." Jane tried to intervene. "You can't treat her in such a way. You have no idea how devastated she was when she heard you were dead," Sarah chipped in. Even George's brothers, who had previously given Stella space to allow their sisters to comfort her, saw a need to stand by her side. "George, don't treat Stella like this. Have you forgotten how long she stood by you throughout your sickness?" Harry, his elder brother, asked him with a severe look. It was a look that showed that he wasn't going to let George bully his wife, even if his traumatic death experience made her forget who she was and what she had done for him. "Brother, you have no idea how devastated she was. She loves you," Michael, another of his brothers, added, but George merely smiled as he motioned for someone to help him out of the casket. Unlike what they all assumed about Stella, only George knew precisely what Stella had done and what she was capable of. For George, it all started about a year ago when his health suddenly took a downward spiral. As a billionaire, money wasn't a problem, and although he was pretty old, he was in perfect health. It was also one of the reasons he was convinced that Stella was also in love with him regardless of her age was how good he looked. He was in his late 60s but looked at least 10 years younger. He dated Stella for a long while and only decided to marry her when he realized just how great a person she was. She owned a big charity organization at a young age and only cared about helping people as much as possible. For him, it was love at first sight. It had taken months for him to get her to agree to be his wife, and when she did, he was over the moon and unable to stop grinning even when everyone wondered what made him so happy. The wedding was elaborate, and although his sisters and brothers insisted that he set up a prenup or at least wait a few more years before he married her, George decided not to. He loved Stella and knew beyond words that Stella felt the same. He had never been married and focused entirely on work and building his company. The fact that he was old made him want to do things that would make him happy without any fear of what the consequences would be. They got married, and for 5 years, George had never been happier. He maintained his health and did medical checkups almost every month. It also helped that Stella insisted on following him to every single one she could, without missing even one appointment. For him, she was a constant support he didn't think he could ever do without, and soon, even his family members could see it. "Doctor, how is my husband? Is everything okay?" He watched Stella ask on one of their usual monthly appointments, speaking to the doctor in front of them. "There's nothing to be worried about. Trust me, your husband is very healthy." The doctor instantly responded, and George couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief. He knew that Stella was bound to outlive him, but the least he wanted was to spend at least 30 more years of blissful happiness with her. At first, even he had doubted her love for him, but after being with her for 5 years, he could no longer do so as he realized how caring and loving she was every day. "Doctor, are you sure about this? Did you do a complete checkup? I want my husband to live for many more years with me," Stella said in a very concerned tone, eyes gleaming intensely with love as she looked over at George. She wrapped one of her hands around George's hand, not minding their open show of affection in front of James, their family doctor. "Spending more money is not a problem, but I don't want to become a widow anytime soon," she continued with a big smile, one that George immediately returned. "Ma'am, trust me on this. With how healthy your husband is, I'm sure he might be able to live at least 30 more years with the best care," the doctor replied, and George instantly beamed at the doctor. "Thank you, doctor. I also intend to work towards it," he replied, to which the doctor smiled and nodded. "It's my job. With your generous donation to our hospital, it's also in our best interest to keep you alive," he responded. In the meantime, unknown to George and James, the doctor, Stella had gone quiet. The smile on her face wasn't as big as the one there before, and even her eyes had a bleak look to them as she lowered her head. 30 years, she whispered, her eyes fluttering a little from the shock of what she had suddenly heard. Stella, are you okay? George asked the moment he finally noticed the sudden change in her mood. I'm not, she whispered to him with a slight frown as she moved closer to whisper in his ears. 30 years is too short, what exactly am I supposed to do for the rest of my life? Stella asked him, staring up at him with a somber expression. George couldn't think of a good response, so he hugged her like usual. Without overthinking, he had already decided that half of all he owned would go to Stella while the other half would go to different charity organizations that she usually talked to him about. He understood that even after he was gone, she would still feel the pain of his passing and felt that giving her a significant part of his money would help. With how kind she was, he was sure that taking care of his family would also be one of the things she would do. They both went home right after. After spending their evenings together, talking, chatting, and watching a few movies, it was finally time to sleep. George had no issues falling asleep, especially since he needed 8 hours of sleep for his health, considering the time he would have to wake up the next day. On the other hand, no matter how hard Stella tried, she found it almost impossible to fall asleep. 30 years, she muttered under her breath as she dug her face into the blanket she used to cover her head. Unlike the joyful expression on her face in the afternoon, she looked scared as she realized that George would have 30 more years to spend with her. What exactly am I going to do? She wondered in a low voice as she turned to look at George, who slept peacefully without a care in the world. Will it really take 30 years for me to become a widow? Stella wondered in her mind, only to shake her head, convinced that the doctor was wrong and it wasn't even something she needed to worry about. A couple of weeks passed, and George was even more delighted to see her pay more attention to his health. Unlike before, she began to follow him in all the sporting activities he did in his free time, and George showed her just how energetic and agile he was when he put his mind to it. He had seen how downcast she was when she heard that he only had at most 30 years to live, and he wanted to ensure that she didn't have to worry about such things anymore. If she didn't know he was a 70-year-old man, she would have never thought he was actually that old. George played different sports, from golf to tennis, and agreed for Stella to follow him to all his gym appointments, delighted to see how shocked she was when she saw him lifting weights she would find difficult to carry. By their next medical appointment the following month, George was delighted to see Stella accept that he would live for at most 30 years, compared to how sad she was at their previous appointment. More excited than usual, he offered for them to have dinner together in one of the restaurants Stella liked to eat, beyond delighted to see how happy she was when she agreed. They went back home, got dressed, and headed out. They were yet to book beforehand, but a table was still waiting for them when they arrived. They just sat down to order food when one of George's business partners walked over to their table the second he spotted them. He was a dashing middle-aged man, and although George noticed Stella's lingering eyes on him, he thought nothing more of it. George, it's been so long, David gushed, stretching his hand out to shake George, who also stretched out his hand to do the same. David, it has. Wasn't expecting to see you here, George replied, instantly shifting his gaze to introduce Stella to him politely. This is my wife, Stella. Your wife. She looks so beautiful I almost assumed she was your daughter, David complimented in a teasing tone, one to which George paid no mind as he watched Stella shake David with a gentle smile. George is my husband, but thank you for the compliment, she responded before watching George say a few more words to him before he left. Don't pay any attention to him. That's just the way he is. He likes to get under people's skin, George explained, and Stella nodded to show that everything was fine. It's okay. I've been married to you for 5 years. Do you really think I care about things like that? She sighed, shaking her head to show that it wasn't something George needed to worry about. George instantly smiled back, turning his attention and the topic of discussion back to the food they had been about to order. The dinner went pretty well, and even after they got home, George thought nothing more about their meeting with David, seeing how vibrant Stella's mood was regardless of what David had said. Their days continued like usual, and the rumors of them being closer than ever began to spread as George took Stella almost everywhere he went. He even began to take her to the company and show her a few things she seemed interested in. Everything was good and well until George suddenly fainted in the company one day. Stella was with him, and they had just entered the elevator when George suddenly felt lightheaded, shocked to feel himself lose control of his body as he suddenly felt himself fall to the ground. He was still conscious, and he could hear the sound of Stella screaming as she hurriedly called for help right before he entirely lost consciousness. When he woke up and opened his eyes, he was surprised to find himself lying on a hospital bed but delighted to see Stella standing beside him, holding his hands. Tears filled her eyes, and she looked worn out, like she had been waiting for hours for him. How long have I been here? George asked with a wry smile as he watched Stella rush to hug him when he popped open his eyes. 3 hours. You were out for 3 hours, George. How do you feel? She hurriedly asked in a concerned tone. She was about to open her mouth to speak again when a doctor walked straight into the interrupting whatever she was about to say. It was Dr. James, the same doctor who usually attended to them at his monthly appointments. How do you feel, George? He asked, and George instantly sighed, trying to lift himself only to feel Stella glare at him before gently pushing him back down. What do you think you're doing? He heard Stella ask and was about to argue, only to stop when he watched a tear roll down her cheek. I feel fine, Stella, but I'll lie down for now. What's wrong with me, doctor? George asked the doctor, who slowly shook his head in response to George's question. You're fine. For now, I think it's stress, and you need a little more rest, Dr. James replied with a professional smile. One that comforted George beyond words. He appeared to be brave, but one of his greatest fears was getting seriously sick. As far as he knew, he still had a few more years to live and no intention of dying anytime soon. He was discharged that same day and spent the rest of the day comforting Stella, trying to convince her he was completely fine. He even tried repeating what the doctor told him about him fainting because of stress, but Stella still looked extremely worried. Days after, she stuck firmly to his side to ensure that nothing like that happened again. She even began to cook most of his meals, making sure that they included more nutrition than the food cooked by the cook they hired. Unlike before, when the checkups were monthly, George listened to Stella's concerns and changed them to bi-weekly checkups in a bid to put her mind at rest. They were both delighted that George was declared completely healthy after numerous scans at the hospital from their family doctor, James. After weeks of rest, George was finally delighted to return to work and his usual routine. He was focused on completing the work he had previously abandoned and was about to finish with a document on his table when he suddenly felt his head spin. His heart suddenly began to race in his chest, and he broke out in a cold sweat. He was sitting and realized that if he had been standing, he would have instantly fallen. He didn't faint or lose consciousness, but even then, he quickly realized that he wasn't as healthy as he thought he was and could be seriously sick. For a whole hour, he laid his head on the table, with a sad demeanor around him, as she thought of what Stella would need to go through if he fell seriously sick and she needed to take care of him. I don't want ever to make her worry about me, George thought to himself, picking up the phone and dialing the number of one of his friends, Harry. He was a doctor in a different hospital and a high-ranking one he trusted. Without telling Stella about it, he intended to try and find a solution to whatever was wrong with him that their family doctor couldn't see. After talking to him for a while, he agreed to meet with him the next day. After George was sure he could stand, he instantly left his company and went home, delighted at the hospitality he received when he got home. What's wrong? She instantly asked, touching his head and face. She stared at him intensely, almost like she was trying to find out if he was hiding anything from her. I'm fine, he responded, picking her up and carrying her into the house with a happy grin. He stepped through the door, planning to carry her into the kitchen where the smell of food was coming from, only to stagger and freeze. Are you okay? He heard Stella whisper to him, to which he quickly nodded, putting her down that very instant. I'm just tired. I'll head upstairs for a while to take a shower, George said, doing his best to pretend to be okay and relieved to see Stella believe him as she nodded and headed straight to the kitchen. George had only reached the top of the stairs when he instantly sank to the floor. His heart felt like it was about to burst out of his chest, and he could barely breathe as he saw nothing but dark spots in his vision. Even then, he only considered making sure that Stella didn't find out. The last thing he wanted to do was make her worry. He dragged himself to the bathroom as quickly as possible, coming downstairs about 30 minutes later with the excuse that he unknowingly fell asleep. Stella hugged him with an understanding look, and he hugged her even tighter, scared of what tomorrow had in store for the both of them. After waving goodbye to Stella, who was getting ready to leave for one of the general meetings of her charity organization, George entered his car and was about to drive off. Remember to come back home early today. Tomorrow is your medical checkup, Stella reminded him, and George promised to leave work early before driving off. However, instead of heading to his company, he drove straight to Harry's specialist hospital to meet him. Throughout the entire period of examination, George waited with bated breath for Harry to announce his face. So what exactly is wrong with me? George asked, trying to maintain a resemblance of calmness he didn't feel. Do you want the good news or bad news first? Harry asked him, and George instantly responded, not having to think twice about it. Bad news, he replied unconsciously, holding his breath while waiting for Harry to answer. The bad news is that I found nothing wrong, and it's bad because there's clearly something wrong, but I just can't see it. And the good news, that it's not too bad if I can't see it, Harry replied with a light chuckle that only grated on George's already frayed nerves as he glared at his friend. Relax, you'll be fine. I need a little more time to see your blood results and the other results that take time, Harry said, patting his back in a comforting manner. You'll be fine. I can assure you that you're not dying anytime soon, Harry informed George, who left a few minutes later. He planned on waiting until Harry called back. The next day was his appointment, and this time, their family doctor again confirmed that everything was fine and gave George some vitamins that could help him. Stella seemed extremely happy as she headed off the kitchen the second they got home, but George hurried to the bedroom, where he instantly lay down. His vision was blurry, and he quickly realized that his symptoms were getting worse. That same day, he gave Stella a random excuse of having to pick something at the office before racing over to Harry's place minutes after Harry called him. "So, did you find out what's wrong with me? You might want to sit down for this, George," Harry replied with a severe look, pointing at the chair beside him. George instantly did as he was told as he listened to Harry explain in detail what was wrong with him. "So what you're saying is that there's a very toxic metal in my blood, and it's one that I've been consuming in tiny bits. That's impossible. What's even more impossible is the fact that you think whosoever is cooking my meals is the one poisoning me. Stella cooks most of my meals, and she could never," George continued to explain, but Harry kept quiet and continued listening to him instead of responding to all he said. "Most importantly, she wasn't even cooking my meals when I first fainted. Trust me, Stella is not that kind of person," George explained in a louder pitch, doing his best to convince Harry, who didn't look convinced. "Even if it's not Stella, what I'm sure of is that someone in your house wants you dead, and they're being super careful about it," Harry told George. Instead of continuing to speak, Harry got off his seat and pulled open a drawer where he brought out a pill. One he passed over to George, who stared at the drug in his hand with a wary expression on his face. "What's this for?" "It's something you should take when you're having your next fainting spell. Call me first, and I'll pick you up," Harry informed George, who continued to stare at the pill in his hand with distrust. "If you don't trust me, you can leave it behind, George." "I can't force you," Harry said with a shrug, even as he continued speaking. "But if you let things continue the way it is, I can assure you that you'll be completely paralyzed in a month, and you'll be dead in 6. Hearing Harry's declaration made George feel a cold tingle down his spine as he closed his palms over the pill he had been given before leaving. George instantly made his way home, delighted to see Stella awake and waiting for him at the door. "Could such a loving wife actually want to kill me?" George thought to himself as Stella handed him a cup of clear, warm water before bed to go with his usual nighttime pills. "What about your medication?" he asked, slightly embarrassed at how suspicious he felt towards her. "I've taken mine." "I can also take yours if you don't want it," Stella kindly offered, and George instantly shook his head before lifting the cup and drinking the water given to him. "Whosoever it is, it's not Stella. I'll find them myself," he decided as he lay on the bed to sleep. He had no idea how many hours he slept, but all he knew was that a sharp, chilling pain in his chest was the response he woke up. "Arg!" George groaned loudly in pain, terrified that he was dying, reaching his hand over to Stella only to realize that she was still sleeping. He tried to speak but couldn't. He even tried to reach over to her, calling for help, but her face was turned towards the wall and she was fast asleep. More out of fear than anything else, George dialed Harry's number and did his best to grab and swallow the pill he had been given. Instantly, he felt the pain slowly start to fade away, and as he tried to get on his feet, he immediately fell to the ground with a heavy thump. No matter how hard he tried to move, he found it extremely difficult until he finally gave up and lay there. Just when he slowly gave up all hope, he suddenly heard the soft ruffling of the sheets, delighted to hear that Stella was awake. What he didn't expect to see was the greatest shock of his life as he saw a vague outline of her body standing in front of him right before his eyes fluttered closed. He could no longer see her, but he somehow managed to hold onto his consciousness long enough to hear her dial a number on her phone. "I'll be fine, she's calling the ambulance," George thought to himself, only to hear her voice loud and clear in the dead of the night. "James, I think I fucked up. I might have put too much in his water. The old man is dying. Yes, I wanted him to die, but that's later. I need him to be paralyzed first so that no one will suspect me. Stop yelling at me. What should I do now? I don't think he's breathing," George heard her say one after the other. He was sure that if he could move his body, he wouldn't have been able to stop himself from reacting. "He's dead. He looks as white as death itself," was the last thing he heard her say before he lost consciousness. The first person George saw when he woke up was Harry, who stood beside his bed with a massive grin. How was the other side? He teased him as he reached out to check his vitals. "Bitter," George spat in response, remembering every word his loving wife had said about him and how she was indeed the one who wanted him dead. Harry, on the other hand, chose not to ask about what happened since he could see the painful expression on George's face. It didn't help that the moment he arrived in an ambulance, the look on Stella's face when she saw him was one of guilt. "So, what exactly do you intend to do now?" Harry asked, curious about what George intended to do with his current situation. "She thinks I'm dead, so I might as well attend my funeral." "Won't you traumatize your loved ones? What if one of them dies of a heart attack?" Harry asked with unhidden curiosity. "The only one that's bound to die from a heart attack is Stella," George replied with a deep conviction in his eyes. It was clear that he had already made up his mind. Everyone gasped in utter shock after listening to the story George had just openly told them. Jane, the closest to Stella, instantly dropped her arm around Stella's waist, the one she had been using to comfort her. You, Jane stuttered, unable to find the right words to use to describe the woman in front of her who had almost successfully killed her brother. Move, please let me hit her, Sarah begged, trying to move closer to Stella, only for Michael, one of her brothers, to stop her. Why? George suddenly asked, drawing everyone's attention back to him when he spoke louder and more aggressively to Stella. What good reason could you possibly have for trying to kill me? He asked, patient enough to wait for her to answer as he watched her wipe off the fake tears on her face. Is it fair for me to spend my entire youth with you, a man over 3 times my age? You knew exactly how old I was when you agreed. You said you loved me, George said, feeling his voice crack a little as he said the latter part in a lower tone than the rest. Love? Of course, I loved you until I knew you still had 30 years to live, Stella replied in an icy tone and an indifferent look. Is it until we go out and people start referring to you as my grandfather that you'll realize we never had a chance? If you knew this, then why did? Harry suddenly stepped before him to stop him from speaking to her. She wanted to kill you. What right answer could you ever hope to hear from a murderer? James, the doctor she colluded with, has been captured, and the police are already on their way, Harry announced. He was barely done speaking when the loud sirens of a police car could be heard from the hall's entrance. I never did such a thing, and there's no evidence for me to go to prison, Stella hysterically yelled, stepping back with a look of horror on her face as she watched police officers stream in through the entrance one after the other. Yes, but there's a witness, one that's alive and well, George told her as he watched the police place handcuffs on her hands and take her away.